The Prime Minister says the UK cannot remain a member of the single market after it leaves the EU. In her most detailed speech since the Brexit vote, Theresa May said instead a global Britain would seek a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the EU. And the Prime Minister confirmed that a final EU deal will be put to the vote in both houses of Parliament.
The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, and my job is to get the right deal for Britain as we do.
There's been mixed reaction to the speech. The Lib Dem leader Tim Farron said the plan would be bad for Britain.
So this is a theft of democracy. This is a presumption that those people, the 51.9% of people who voted to leave in June last year, meant the most extreme version of Brexit available.
Also this lunchtime, the rate of inflation rose sharply last month, largely due to higher prices for fuel and food. The Libyan man who claims Britain was involved in abducting and transporting him to Tripoli is given the go-ahead to take legal action. A teenager has been arrested on suspicion of murdering a 16-year-old girl, Leon Weeks, who was found yesterday on a pathway in Rotherham. And how Donald Trump's latest tweet in praise of his daughter Ivanka brought internet fame to an unsuspecting woman in Brighton.
Here, a train driver's strike on Southern Railway is called off after the company accepts offers of talks, and patients groups fear health cuts are underway before they're properly consulted.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Prime Minister says the UK will leave the European single market when it quits the European Union. In her long-awaited speech on the impact of Britain leaving the EU, Theresa May said instead she would seek a bold and ambitious new free trade agreement with Europe for a global Britain. Mrs May also confirmed that any final deal could be phased in and that both Houses of Parliament will get to vote on it. We'll be getting political and business reaction and explaining what it will mean for the UK. But first, our political correspondent Ian Watson on Theresa May's vision of Brexit Britain.
Good morning, what's the plan?
You've heard her slogan, Brexit means Brexit. Today, we saw some of the substance. Theresa May voted to remain in the European Union, but she consulted leading Leave campaigners.
What's the plan for Brexit?
Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and the Brexit Secretary David Davis over the most important speech she's made since becoming Prime Minister. She didn't give a detailed plan for Brexit, but she did set out a direction of travel.
Not partial membership of the European Union, associate membership of the European Union, or anything that leaves us half in, half out. But I want to be clear. What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market.
Inside the European single market, there are no trade barriers, no tariffs between member states, but they do all have to abide by common rules, and one of those is to allow free movement of people as well as goods. That makes it difficult to limit immigration. The Prime Minister said she wanted a new free trade deal with the EU, but control of the UK's borders was politically important.
The message from the public before and during the referendum campaign was clear. Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe.
And she said Britain would have to come out of some aspects of the EU's customs union, or possibly leave entirely. The customs union does away with tariffs on goods within the EU, but imposes a charge on products coming from outside. Full membership would limit the ability to do the sort of trade deals that the Prime Minister favours.
It is true that full customs union membership prevents us from negotiating our own comprehensive trade deals. Now, I want Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements, but I also want tariff-free trade with Europe and cross-border trade there to be as frictionless as possible.
But whatever changes the government wants to make in their relationship with the EU, the Prime Minister also hinted that she wanted to give businesses time to adjust.
It is in no one's interests for there to be a cliff edge for business or a threat to stability as we change from our existing relationship to a new partnership with the EU.
The Prime Minister's given us a bit more clarity on the negotiating position today, but in doing so, she's also given more ammunition to her opponents for their attack. Previously, denouncing statements such as a red, white and blue Brexit was a bit like bottling fog, but today the battle lines on Brexit seemed more firmly drawn.
Throughout the speech, there seemed to be an implied threat that somewhere along the line, if all her optimism of a deal with the European Union didn't work, we would move into a low-tax corporate taxation, bargain basement economy on the offshores of Europe.
I think the Prime Minister must not wave the white flag and give up on our membership of the single market. If she cares about Britain's future, if she's going to fight for Britain and fight our corner, then she needs to be fighting for Britain to be in the single market, even if we leave the European Union.
But the really difficult bit for the Prime Minister will be to persuade the 27 other EU countries to listen to the UK's demands. She has made it clear today that no deal would be better than a bad deal, and that MPs will get the final say. Ian Watson, BBC News.
So the Prime Minister has confirmed that Britain will leave the single market and wants a different relationship with what's known as the European Customs Union. But what exactly does it all mean? Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is here to explain.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Well, of course, the reason this is economically important is we sell more goods and services to the other 27 member countries of the European Union than to anywhere else. It's our biggest trading partner, not least because it's our closest trading partner, with nearly half of our exports going to EU member countries. Now, if you're a British exporter, it's very obvious what the single market means. Whatever you make in the UK, you can sell anywhere in the EU. No member country can block you. That's free movement of goods. You can also invest capital anywhere, and any member country can invest in your country. Member states promise not to block that either. And in theory, at least, you also have free movement of services and, more controversially, free movement of people. The fear is if we leave the single market, our exporters won't be able to sell as much to our main trading partner, so the economy will grow more slowly. Now, there'd be a similar effect if we left the customs union. Well before the EU, countries used to try to stop cheap imports, undercutting their own industries, especially with high-value goods like cars. They'd slap a tariff on, a form of tax, to make the goods more expensive. Under the customs union, members of the EU agreed to scrap tariffs on each other's goods. But if we exit the customs union, those tariffs might come back, making, for example, our car exports less competitive. That's one reason the pound dropped so sharply here after the referendum. You can see it there, because of fears we'd export less, damaging our economy. The pound's lost about a fifth of its value, and that started to drive up prices. To this Heathrow-based haulier, the effect is very obvious. Because the pound's weaker, you need more pounds to buy the same goods in dollars. Fuel had been falling in price. On today's inflation numbers, it's up by 10%. The company can absorb the cost, but not forever.
The cost of the fuel is starting to bite. Eventually, we'll have to put a fuel surcharge in, like everybody else in this industry, once we go past a certain level, because we cannot afford to keep those costs in-house.
The effect of the weaker pound is most obvious up the supply chain, where raw materials, most of them imported, are up by 15.8% year on year. So far, producers haven't been passing most of that on, with prices at the factory gate up 2.7%. Only now is that starting to feed through to shop prices, up 1.6%.
Sterling is having an impact now, and we're seeing input prices, factory gate data pushing up quite markedly, and that is the sharp fall in sterling since the Brexit vote that's driving a lot of that. But the bigger move from the sterling effect is still to come, because contracts have to be renewed, and that's where we think inflation moves up much further from the 1.6% that we've seen today, above 3%.
Food prices are still lower than they were last year, but goods prices generally had been falling for most of the last 2 years. They're not anymore. The return of inflation may be temporary, a one-off adjustment, or if workers start demanding higher wages, it could become permanent. The weak pound has also prompted US companies who do a lot of business in the UK to bump up their prices. They may be making the same money or more here in the UK in pounds, but when that's exchanged for US dollars, it's much less. So the likes of Apple are raising their UK prices to make up. Within 7 days, an app which now costs 79 pence will cost 99 pence, a 25% rise. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Let's speak to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. It has been a long time coming, but finally some flesh on the bones, the Prime Minister's vision of post-Brexit Britain.
I think we are a nudge further forward. We have learnt a bit today, but we absolutely have not been given Mrs May's blueprint for Brexit. This was not Mrs May drawing back the curtains on her master plan for leaving the European Union. We did learn, yes, we are leaving the single market, something that many would say has been inevitable since Mrs May signalled she wanted to end freedom of movement and the jurisdiction of the European Court. We learned that MPs are to get a vote on the final Brexit deal, and we learned that Mrs May is absolutely not interested in some sort of associate membership of the European Union. But on key areas such as immigration, really, we are no further forward. She said she wanted to reduce the numbers, but no clarity on the mechanism for doing so. On the customs union, Mrs May said she wanted the benefits of being outside to negotiate our own trade deals, but she wanted the benefits of remaining inside to ensure tariff-free trade. Similarly, on a possible transitional deal, she said she wanted to avoid permanent purgatory, to have an implementation process, but no clarity on the sort of time we might have for this transitional period. And the reason for this ambiguity in these key areas is because Mrs May is deeply wary of revealing her intentions to our EU partners ahead of the critical negotiations. She said she will not be pressed into revealing more than she has to if she fears it's going to damage the national interest. There are, I would suggest, two other reasons why we didn't learn more today. One is there is still active debate, discussion, disagreement within government over critical areas like immigration. And finally, Mrs May is instinctively a cautious politician who is reluctant to reveal more than she absolutely has to.
Norman Smith, thank you. Well, talking of those EU partners, let's go straight to Brussels and speak to our correspondent there, Gavin Lee. And Mrs May warned Europe's leaders this morning that no deal for Britain was better than a bad deal. What's been the reaction there so far?
I think there are two takeaways from it. I mean, first of all, the fog is a little clearer. There are lots of European capitals. I spoke to different ministries where they thought actually the single market may be something that Britain wanted to remain in. So first of all, that clears that up and it allows the negotiating teams for the EU to start to converge on a position before negotiations start proper when Article 50 is triggered. We're getting some early reaction actually around capitals within an hour of the speech from Germany, the foreign ministry saying they welcome the clarity after 7 months. They can start to work out a good deal. From Latvia, from the Czech Republic as well, saying that they believe this is a good first opener from Theresa May. The former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt saying this was a mistake. This is not what he thought he wanted to see. And this is for Sweden, he said, this is actually worse relations with Britain and the EU. So I don't think it's entirely flattering across the EU. No comment yet from the main institutions, the European Commission. We're told in Strasbourg many of the commissioners were watching the news on a mobile phone a short while ago. So I think as we get through the afternoon, we will start to hear how the European Union reacts. But I think the main thing is they can start to work out a strategy from here.
Gavin, thank you. And to Switzerland now, from where business leaders from around the world have gathered for the annual World Economic Forum. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is there. And Simon, what has been the reaction so far?
Well, we've got a very clear message, no ifs, no buts, no single market. And as Norman was saying, I think most companies had sort of given up, conceded. It's not what they wanted, but they have accepted that as a reality, as being incompatible with her ambitions to control migration. I was very interested to hear more detail on the transitional period. This is what happens 2 years from triggering Article 50. And what she said today, we're not going to have some never-ending standstill agreement, some purgatory where we just keep on negotiating. We want the deal in principle struck within 2 years with some implementation phases so everyone can get used to the idea. Now, businesses are very worried that getting that deal in principle within 2 years is pretty unrealistic, and that what we might do is then fall off a cliff into this regulatory and trade no man's land, and people have warned that that would be very damaging. I thought it was also very interesting. She repeated the threat that Philip Hammond raised, saying that if we don't get a good deal, if you play hardball with us, then we can always lower our taxes and change our economic model. That means become a lower tax jurisdiction for multinational companies. Now, some people will say, I'm not sure that that's what people voted for on June the 24th, but that's the aggressive tone she struck today. But as I say, businesses worried that the timetable she's got for completing these deals is still a bit unrealistic.
Our business editor, Simon Jack, thank you. And what about the voters? 6 months after the EU referendum, what do people make of Mrs May's speech this morning? Our correspondent Phil Mackey has been to Birmingham, where people voted by a narrow margin to leave the European Union.
When the country voted to leave the EU last year, it was a close vote nationally. 52% in favour of Brexit, 48% in favour of Remain. In Birmingham, it was even closer. 500,000 people went to the polls in this city, and the winning margin for leave was only just under 4,000 votes. So now people have an inkling of what Brexit means. What do they think?
Andy and Debbie are typical. One voted leave, the other remain.
If it's too high a price to remain in the single market, in terms of the price we have to pay for immigration, it's a fair trade-off in my opinion.
I'm afraid to say, even though I voted to stay in, it just probably makes sense because, you know, going forward, if we're out, we're out.
Making the coffees are Maria from Slovakia and Veronica from Hungary. Both might be allowed to stay, but in the future, for people wanting to work here, life could be more difficult.
I would like to choose what country I want to live in or work it. So if I have to leave just because of Brexit, I wouldn't like it.
The salary is much better than Hungary, even if you do the same job.
And for the English manager of this independent coffee shop, tougher border controls would mean a real headache when recruiting staff.
1 out of 10 CVs that come over the counter on a weekly basis are European, so if that was restricted, it would be difficult to recruit people, especially full-time members of staff, which is very hard to come by.
For many in the second city, the prospect of Brexit is still filled with optimism, but in a city that's so evenly split, others are still left with a bitter taste. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Birmingham.
The rest of the news now, and a Libyan man has won the right to sue the British government, including the former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, over claims of kidnap and torture. Abdul Hakim Belhaj, a former opponent of Colonel Gaddafi, was arrested in Bangkok, taken to Libya and questioned by agents from MI6 and the CIA. Mr Straw has denied any involvement. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
Libya, 2011. Colonel Gaddafi's been toppled and it's chaos. Among the files strewn across the offices of his security service, a document comes to light, suggesting Britain played a part in the abduction and torture of a Libyan dissident. He's Abdul Hakim Belhaj, once regarded as a terror suspect. Now he's been told by Britain's highest court he can sue MI6 and the government, which tried to halt the case.
The Supreme Court unanimously dismisses the government's appeals.
Normally, the English courts can't consider cases involving what foreign governments have done abroad. But in this judgment, the Supreme Court has concluded that that doesn't prevent the courts here from considering British involvement in what's happened. After all, it says, these are serious allegations of torture regarded as abhorrent in English law. In this jail, Mr Belhaj says he was tortured after he and his pregnant wife were intercepted by US agents and flown to Libya. In the key document, an MI6 officer appears to write to a Gaddafi official welcoming the safe arrival of Mr Belhaj, using his alternative name, but also describing him as air cargo. The letter says the intelligence that led to his capture was British. A court will now be asked to consider whether the UK was involved. But Mr Belhaj and his supporters say he and his wife believe it doesn't need to go that far.
For them, it's really just about justice. All they've really wanted is an apology and an acknowledgement from Britain that what happened to Mr Belhaj and Ms Bouchar, a pregnant woman at the time of her rendition, was wrong. That's all they want.
Labour's Jack Straw was Foreign Secretary at the time and is now lead defendant in the case. He says he acted within the law and was never complicit with what might have gone on abroad. Tom Simons, BBC News, at the Supreme Court.
The time is almost 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. Theresa May says the UK will not remain a member of the single market after it leaves the EU. And coming up,
it's day 2 of our road trip through Donald Trump's America. Today we're heading to Chicago, the hometown of Barack Obama.
Coming up on South Today, we're at a preschool which specialises in helping children with special needs and is facing closure because it's run out of lottery funding. And the Ice Maiden cometh. We catch up with the all-female team training to trek across the South Pole.
The inquests into the deaths of 30 British tourists at a Tunisian beach resort 18 months ago is underway in London. This morning, the court has been hearing from a senior Foreign Office official. She's been defending the advice given to travellers heading to Tunisia at the time. Our correspondent Richard Galpin has the latest.
Day 2 of the inquest, and for the families of those killed, a chance to hear more crucial testimony from the Foreign Office and from the tourism company which sold them the holidays in Tunisia. These are the 30 British holidaymakers who were killed in the attack. Could more have been done to warn them of the risks of travelling to Tunisia in June 2015, just months after a major terrorist attack in the capital? This video, played in the courtroom yesterday, shows the gunman Seyfuddin Rezgi arriving in the resort near Sousse at the start of his attack. Proof he had accomplices who were probably linked to the earlier atrocity in the capital. And the way Rezgi was able to systematically shoot dead so many tourists has shown how little security there was at the resort, even though the Tunisians had said security had been improved. Today, a senior Foreign Office official admitted they had not been formally monitoring the security arrangements in Tunisia, but did say their travel advice stressed the high risk of terrorist attacks, including in areas visited by foreigners.
Next in line to give evidence here at the inquest will be TUI, the parent company of Thomson, which sold all the package holidays to those who were killed. It also is likely to face some tough questions. Richard Galpin, BBC News at the High Court in London.
An 18-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of a teenage girl whose body was found on a pathway in Rotherham. The girl has been named locally as 16-year-old Leon Weeks. South Yorkshire police say her body was found by members of the public yesterday morning. Well, our correspondent Danny Savage is in Rotherham. What is the latest, Danny? Apologies, we don't seem to have the sound there to Danny Savage at the moment. The rest of the news, though, the search for a Malaysian airliner that vanished 3 years ago with 239 people on board has been called off. An underwater search for debris from flight MH370 has failed to discover a significant amount of wreckage. The families of those on board say the decision to stop searching is irresponsible. The plane disappeared on its way from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing after turning off course. One of the unions behind the Southern Rail strikes has agreed to suspend 3 days of industrial action next week while fresh talks hosted by the TUC take place. Representatives from the drivers' union ASLEF will meet for talks on Wednesday. The last man to walk on the moon, the astronaut Gene Cernan, has died at the age of 82.
This is Gene, and I'm on the surface.
Captain Cernan was one of only 3 people to go to the moon twice, and as commander of NASA's Apollo 17 mission, he was the last man to leave a footprint on the lunar surface in 1972. His death means only 6 of the 12 men who have walked on the moon are still alive. Now, in 4 days' time, Donald Trump takes over the White House, becoming the 45th president of the United States. It marks the end of Barack Obama's 8 years in the Oval Office. All this week, our correspondent John Kay is travelling along Highway 45, gauging the country's mood. Today, he's in Chicago, Illinois, where Barack Obama began his political career and where people have been reflecting on the legacy that he leaves behind.
Right through the middle of Donald Trump's America, to get a sense of the country he's taking over. But our next stop is not Trump territory, Chicago. This is Barack Obama's favourite diner. He lived round the corner before he was president, and he still comes back.
Reggie Ahmed on the line. Everything Ahmed on the line.
He is humble. He is strong.
Tahisha is an Obama fan. As a nurse, she likes the changes he made to healthcare, giving poorer people better access. She worries Donald Trump will overturn the reforms, hitting the most vulnerable.
Many of them will be very sick, can't get medicine. Some of them will die.
Her son Daniel thought having a black president would mean a more inclusive America. But he fears Donald Trump's brand of populism is now encouraging division.
I do feel my safety might be, in danger.
Really, you feel more vulnerable now?
I do. In certain situations, I do. And more
post-Trump?
Post-Trump, yes, because it is something that you can see from the energy that Trump built and the way that people express themselves who support Trump. A lot of them have certain beliefs and things like that that do not align with my existence.
Some here do question the Obama legacy and think change is overdue. Aspiring businesswoman Erica hopes Donald Trump will help people like her.
Next, please.
I believe that it's going to open up doors for small business owners, hopefully, that's trying to create big businesses.
That's you?
Yeah.
Maybe you'll be as rich as Donald Trump in a few years. We head to the suburbs, Elgin, where nearly half the population is Hispanic. Donald Trump's plans to build a giant wall along the Mexican border mean many here cannot support him.
Never.
But some views here may surprise you. Rosa hopes a wall would stop illegal immigrants.
We have our own problems here in America, so, to add more, more of them coming over here, I don't think it's a good thing.
And in the choir, Margarita hopes Donald Trump will safeguard her pro-life Catholic values.
I'm so excited and I'm so happy for him. And we should not be afraid of anything, not even a wall or anything.
It seems this Hispanic community is split just as America is split. And look where we are. Time to get back on Route 45. John Kay, BBC News, Chicago.
And tomorrow, John Kay continues his journey down Route 45. He will be in Tennessee. Now, it is a month since Syrian government forces retook rebel areas of the country's second city, Aleppo. Now, new peace talks are due to begin next week between the Syria government and some of the rebel groups who've been fighting against President Assad's regime for the last 6 years. Our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, is in Aleppo for us now. Describe what life is like there now, Jeremy.
Well, in the eastern sections of the city that were captured by the regime, life is really very hard. No running water, no mains power, and a massive amount of devastation. What you can see behind me is a tiny fraction of what's happened in this city. You can drive a couple of miles in one direction in East Aleppo and everything is destroyed. Then drive a couple of miles in the other direction and everything is destroyed. It really is that bad. I've been to a lot of wars over the years, and the only place I've seen that rivals this in terms of sheer destruction is Grozny in Chechnya in the former Soviet Union in the mid-90s, when the Russian army absolutely hammered it. East Aleppo was absolutely pulverized.
Jeremy Bowen there with the latest from Aleppo. Thank you. Time now for a look at the weather, and Phil Avery is here. What have you got for us?
Thanks very much. An awful lot of clouds. If you were with me yesterday, you'll remember that we were looking at this sort of satellite picture. In fact, there are some variations on the theme here, and I just want to fly you in towards the thicker cloud and old weather fronts. Now, I'm saying it's a weak affair, but if you spent the morning underneath it, as they will have done in Bridlington and Stafford and a number of other places, it's pretty miserable fare. There's bits and pieces of rain and drizzle. But if we just turn our gaze a little bit more towards East Anglia and the southeast, recent cloud becomes what cloud?
And you see what I mean? Again, our weather watchers are talking the talk for us admirably. Clear skies there for the most part. I would just say that if you're beginning to get a little bit envious of that southeastern quarter with all its sunshine, if you haven't seen any so far today and are not likely to see any, it comes at something of a price. 3 degrees only, some are even lower than that. And yet with the mild breezes coming up and over the hills of Scotland, the eastern side of Scotland, the Moray Firth, 13 degrees. And as soon as the sun is down, my word, those temperatures will fall away again in the southeastern quarter. We'll come to that in a second. But with the breeze and more cloud across northern and western parts, it's helping to keep the temperatures up. In the towns and cities, we'll be around about sort of 0, 1 degree or so. That's but part of the story, because in the countryside, somewhere across the southeast tonight, around about -4 or -5. So there is obviously something going on here. The last significant influence for the southeastern quarter was a tapping into a relatively cold continent. Those are the daytime maxima yet again across the heart of the continent. And the reason for the connection between the two, well, it's the high pressure. And without getting too dad's army about it, there is that flow from the high pressure into the southeastern quarter of the British Isles. So yet again, as was the case today, you will have a frosty start. A bright one, yes. A dry one, yes, but a frosty one. A different story across the northwestern quarter of Scotland. Breezy, wet, cloudy here. And a lot of cloud again. The old front may just have enough about it for the odd spot of rain somewhere across the Midlands and Wales. But again, we've got that differentiation both by day and by night in those temperatures between the rest of the country and that southeastern quarter. We just begin to smooth that differentiation out somewhat as you get on into Thursday, because we lose some of that flow from the continent. Still a lot of cloud. And notice the temperatures, as I say, just beginning to sort of even up a touch. 7, 8 degrees just about covers it. As we move towards the weekend, there is still a lot of cloud, not too much in the way of breeze for many of us, but you'll see that those temperatures are beginning to settle in the middle of that wide disparity. Somewhere around about 7 will cover it. Sophie.
Phil, thank you. Now, our main story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister says the UK cannot remain a member of the single market after it leaves the EU.
The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, and my job is to get the right deal for Britain as we do.
Well, there's been mixed reaction to the speech. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has called on the Prime Minister to be clearer about what her long-term objectives are on the UK's withdrawal from the EU, and says that she seems to be wanting to have her cake and eat it when it comes to the single market. The Lib Dem leader Tim Farron said the plan would be bad for Britain.
So this is a theft of democracy. This is a presumption that those people, the 51.9% of people who voted to leave in June last year, meant the most extreme version of Brexit available.
Plenty more coverage of that throughout the afternoon, of course, on BBC News. But that is all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me on BBC One. We join the BBC News teams where you are. Bye-bye.